in the book of Esther, and Esther is intimately tied to the Jewish tradition and holiday and festival of Purim. Let me hear you say Purim this morning. Now, if you don't know anything about Purim, you're like me as of this week. I actually had to go look up some things about Purim to understand what it was about. And I came across this excellent YouTube video, and it was narrated by a woman named Liron Amiel. And she talked about how Purim, the Jewish festival and holiday, is the Jewish Halloween, essentially, in that there's costumes and parties, and then she says, and in absolutely no other respect whatsoever. There are three main elements to Purim and the way that Jews celebrate Purim to this day. One is they dress up in costumes in order to honor Esther and the fact that she hid her Judaism. The second is they get these groggers or noisemakers in order to blot out the name of Haman, the enemy or villain in this story. And you may say to yourself, that's an interesting thing to blot out or forget. It's because in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses paradoxically asks the Jewish community to remember to forget all the descendants of Amalek, of which Haman is one. So you have to remember to forget him, David says. So in order to do that, whenever Haman's name is mentioned, they all make noise and twirl these groggers to blot out his name. And then the third element to Purim are these triangular-shaped cookies, which are called I butchered it. I'm sorry to all my Jewish siblings. Hamantash. Can I hear you say Hamantash this morning? And Purim this year will be celebrated from March 13 to 14. It does rotate based on the Jewish calendar. And it is all based in the book of Esther. And at synagogues on March 13 to 14, they will read the book of Esther in its entirety on that day. Now, the book of Esther is a fascinating book because its inclusion in the biblical canon was very controversial. So controversial, in fact, that our earliest manuscripts, aka the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in 1947 near the Dead Sea, they contain no record or copies of the book of Esther. These manuscripts that were found near the Dead Sea were from the 3rd to 1st century BCE. And we have a very strong suspicion because Esther wasn't included in these scrolls, that Esther wasn't considered to be part of the Hebrew Bible in the 3rd to 1st century BCE. Not only that, but if you read the entire New Testament for Christians, there is not one reference at all to the book of Esther. And so scholars believe that this book was finally included in the Hebrew Bible and then in extension, the Christian Bible, sometime around the 3rd to 4th century CE, after the life and death and resurrection of Christ. And you may say, well, why was this book so controversial? Why did it have such a hard time being recognized as part of the canon? Well, the reason why is because if you think about what makes up books of the Bible, usually it's words that are included that really make it feel like a book of the Bible. You know, words like God and Lord and covenant and temple and sacrifice and prayer. And none of these words are in the book of Esther. Not once. There's no reference to God or Lord or covenant, temple, sacrifice, prayer. They don't show up anywhere in this book. In fact, it is only one of 2 books in the entire Bible that don't mention God at all. The other is Song of Solomon. And a scholar and an authority on the book of Esther is a woman named Dr. Mary Joan Wynne Leith. And when she points this out, that Esther doesn't mention God and neither does Song of Solomon, she says it's interesting because both Esther and the Song of Solomon celebrate it, albeit in different contexts, the power of feminine sexuality. And in order for us to talk more openly and honestly about all of the references and the innuendo and the celebration of feminine sexuality, we will take your questions and also talk about that at this event that's coming up in February, where we talk about sex and spirituality. And that conversation is really for people over the age of 18, because Esther can be quite explicit in some certain sections. But when you look at Esther, it doesn't mention God at all. And so it was a long time before people warmed up to the idea of it being included in the Bible. Not only that, but if you look through all of modern archaeology, there isn't one reference or archaeological find that supports the historical story of the book of Esther. And so when Dr. Leith asks us to talk about Esther today, she says it's better not to think of this as a work of history, but instead think of it as a historical novella. That is a fictional story within a historical framework. And the reason we do this is because there's not one reference archaeologically to the characters that are referenced in this Bible, or in this book. And there's also a different king's name and different queens, but it is definitely set at a specific time. So it's better to think of this book as a historical novella. I've read a historical novella in my life. It's very long, and I just want credit for reading it in front of you because I want to be proud of myself. How many of you read Shogun by James Clavell? It came out in 1975. I read the whole thing, and so did you. We did it. It's like 900 pages. Sorry about that exaggeration, everybody. But you may be more familiar with Shogun because they've recently redone it as a series on Hulu. That whole series is a historical novella. It's set in feudal Japan. There are characters who symbolize real characters in history, but it's not a historical story. And so Esther is actually much better understood in that same category as Shogun, even though it's concluded within our own Bible. Now, I've been around the church for a few years, and I know that church people always love the true historical stories more than the historical fiction. We have in our mind that if it's true and it happened, it's somehow a more valuable story than if it's a made-up story. Which is funny, because when Jesus was trying to get people to change their ways of living, he would often tell them not historical stories, but more frequently tell them fictional stories known as parables. And so parables, according to Jesus, have the power to change people. I don't think there is anything less valuable about Esther because I believe it's a historical novel. And it's supported by modern biblical scholarship. And to help illustrate this, I recently went out with a friend to coffee, and they decided to ask me a question, kind of start our conversation. And I love this question that started off our conversation together. She asked me, "What novel changed your life?" And it was I had to think about it. I had to think about which novel had changed my life. And what I loved about this question is it assumes that fictional works can change the way that we live, which is very deeply rooted in the tradition of Christianity. So we're going to dive into the book of Esther, and I just want to invite everybody to let go of the idea that this story needs to be true and has to have historically happened in order for it to matter. This story can change our lives. It can lead us closer to God, even if it doesn't mention God. And it can teach us something about how to become more loving people in the year 2025 and beyond. Does that sound good to all of you? Okay, there's 22 of you that are with me. The rest of you will get by the end of this sermon. Let's open the book of Esther, shall we? We read, the following events took place during the time of Ahasuerus. Let me hear you say Ahasuerus this morning. Yes, this guy was the king of Persia, the same Ahasuerus who ruled 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. The Persian Empire was huge, and this story takes place at the height of the Persian Empire. To remind you how big that is, I put it up on a map from India all the way to Ethiopia. We read, when he, being the king, set up the imperial throne in the capital city of Susa. Let me hear you say Susa this morning. Now, Susa is a long ways away from Jerusalem, where most of the biblical stories take place. And here we have Jews living in the diaspora, or the spreading out, living in Susa under Persian rule. And this story unfolds with Esther in just a few moments. Living in diaspora is the right term. We continue to read here. During the 3rd year of King Ahasuerus' reign, he gave a feast for all the government officials and members of the royal court, as well as the governors of Persia and Media and all the nobles and administrators of the provinces. He goes on to say, so Ahasuerus put all the wealth on the empire on display for many days, 180 in all, with a great show of pomp and grandeur, which is a bit redundant, isn't it? If you're going to put on a feast for 6 months, of course it's going to involve a lot of pomp and grandeur, right? So this is a 6-month feast in which the king wants to show off how wealthy he is to all of his people. We continue to read, at the end of these 6 months, Ahasuerus gave a banquet for everyone in the capital city of Susa, both the mighty and the lowly. In other words, for 6 months, the rich, the elite, the powerful have had a fun banquet, and then at the end of that, he's like, I guess we should invite everybody now. And so we would assume this is another feast that will go on for another 6 months. But in the next verse, we read, the banquet lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard of the royal gardens. In other words, the rich got a 6-month party, everyone got a 7-day party. Vast difference in economic wealth there, right? And this party that lasted for 7 days was just as extravagant as the 6 months that preceded it. The book of Esther tells us that the royal courts were clothed in drapes of purple and white. The king put out couches of silver and gold, which is a very strange flex. And he put out these couches for people to sit in, and then he made goblets of gold and filled them with wine. And no two goblets, according to the book of Esther, were alike. And so this party went on for 7 days. And at the same time, Ahasuerus was hosting this party for all the men in his court. His queen, Vashti, hosted a party for all the women in her court for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, we read what happens next. On the 7th day of the revels, Ahasuerus was drunk after a great deal of wine. I mean, 6 months and 7 days will do that, right? He gets so drunk that he comes up with an idea. He brings his messengers. He goes and gets 7 men with 7 eunuchs. He ordered Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended to his every need. And he says to them, bring me Queen Vashti into my presence, and I want you to crown her with the royal diadem, the crown, to put on a show of beauty. Now, you'll notice this cross right here, and that's from the Inclusive Bible. And if you look up in the Inclusive Bible what that cross represents, the footnote says that this was the Hebrew language for a lewd sexual act. So he sends for Vashti and says, I want you to come perform this lewd sexual act in front of everybody, for those present and for the government officials, because she was very beautiful, the narrator tells us. Now, if you read the New Revised Standard Version, it reads a little differently, but it's worth looking at different translations. We read here, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. I've read a number of commentators who read wearing the royal crown as an implication that she was going to wear only the royal crown in front of all these men to show off her beauty. So you can see there's some problems happening here, to say the least. So these 7 men and these 7 eunuchs go and get Queen Vashti, and they tell her what the king wants her to do. And we read in the next verse, but Queen Vashti rebuffed the eunuchs and refused to obey the order. Can I get an amen? One person gave me an amen. We got to talk about some morals here, people. There we go. So Queen Vashti rebuffed the eunuchs and refused to obey the order of the king, who was basically assaulting her at this point, right? The eunuchs then go back to the king and they say, Queen Vashti's not going to do what you say. And we read about how the king became irate and his rage boiled over. He becomes so angry that he called a committee meeting of all of his governors of the province, the highest members of his cabinet, and he brought them together, and we read about who was there at this party. He called Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan. He brought them all together, the 7 governors of Persia and Media who had special access to the royal court and held the top offices of the empire. This is the equivalent of him calling the Supreme Court together and saying, I have a dilemma and I want us to figure out, what does the law say about this? About Vashti telling me no when I told her to do something. He goes on to say, how do we deal with the matter of Vashti's disobedience of the order which I, Ahasuerus, delivered to her through the eunuchs? And it's here that one of the governors, Memucan, let me hear you say Memucan this morning. Memucan stands up with what he thinks is a brilliant idea. He says that Vashti has shown disrespect not only to you, O great king, but also to all the governors and peoples in all the provinces of your empire. She's disrespected them all, he says. He goes on to say, news of her conduct will spread to the women of all the empire, and it will fan the flames of insolence among them toward their spouses. They could say, look, Ahasuerus ordered Vashti to appear before him, and she refused. The spouses of all the governors of Persia and Media will hear of Vashti's behavior by the end of the day, and will start talking to the governors in the same manner. That will encourage anger and scorn all around. If women start telling us that we're going to behave like Queen Vashti, we're in trouble, Memucan says, and I think he's right, isn't he? He goes on to say, if it is your will then, O great king, issue a royal decree to be fixed irreversibly into the laws of Persia and Media, which states that Vashti is to never again appear before Ahasuerus, and that her position is to be given to another who is more worthy. Banish Vashti. Make an example out of her, O great king, because we can't have word getting out that wives can tell their husbands no. He goes on to say, let this decree which you issue to be proclaimed throughout the length and breadth of your empire, so that all women, whether aristocrat or commoner, will from now on submit to the authority of their husbands. King Ahasuerus hears all of this, and he likes it. We read, Ahasuerus was very impressed with Memucan's speech, so he and the governors did as Memucan advised. He sent letters to all the provinces of the empire, each letter in the language and script of the province, declaring that every husband be proclaimed the head of the house. And while it's not implied explicitly, it is implied implicitly that he treats Vashti the exact way that Memucan states. Banishes her, says, I'll never speak to you again, and it's time for me to find a new queen. Now, we are reading the book of Esther, and this brings the first chapter of Esther to a close. And as you all know, this book is called Esther and not Vashti. And the reason this story starts the whole book of Esther is because Esther's story unfolds directly because of Vashti's actions. And when we look closely at the story, Vashti in this story appears to be a footnote. After all, her doing this opens up a spot, if that's the right way to say it, to be the king's new queen for Esther, which we read about in chapter 2. Not only that, but when we look at what Vashti actually does, she really only gets 1 to 2 sentences in this first chapter. We read that Queen Vashti rebuffed the eunuchs and refused to obey the order. And while she is treated like a footnote by the author, when you look closely at it, especially in 2025, with all of our modern conversations about sexual ethics, Vashti is not just a footnote, is she? In reality, Vashti is a biblical hero. She is a biblical hero that we should be celebrating. This is also pointed out by Liron Amiel in her video where she says, more recently in the Jewish tradition, people have started cheering when Vashti shows up and she rebuffs the king. She is starting to be seen more and more as a hero within the Jewish community. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, that sounds good, but what exactly did she do that we could call her a biblical hero? After all, this is the book of the Bible that doesn't mention God. She doesn't say, well, Yahweh gives me the authority to say to you, O King Ahasuerus, that I don't have to do what you want. She just says no. And that's not really religious language. She can't be a religious leader if that's all she says is no, right? But Esther's inclusion in the biblical canon raises all kinds of questions that are worth asking about what makes something holy. Because if we call the Bible holy, and it includes a book that doesn't even mention God, then the next question becomes, does the name God need to be mentioned in order to make something holy? Of course not. Of course not. How many of you held a brand new baby for the first time? And how many of you thought, wow, I am humbled. There is something beautiful in this moment. Well, is it only a holy moment in your life if you say, praise be to God for this infant that's in my arms? Or can you just say, wow, and the moment is equally as holy? I would argue that the latter is just as true as the former. How many of you have been over to a friend's house to eat, and you're just talking, and the food is transcendent, and you're laughing, and you're reminiscing, you're dreaming, you're sharing yourselves, you're vulnerable with one another, and it feels like 20 minutes has passed, and all of a sudden you look at your watch, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's midnight, and you lost track of time completely because you were enjoying yourself so much. Well, is it because you were having a Bible study in that moment? No. It was because you were simply enjoying the goodness of life that God has so generously given to you. How many of you looked at the mountains and rather than thinking like, oh, this proves the atheists wrong, instead think, wow, this is gorgeous. And you feel small next to a mountain as you consider that this peak has been there for millions, if not billions of years. And you are there for just a few fleeting moments to take it in with your eyes. And it's almost like the mountain exists for all that time so that you could one day see it in this here and now. Well, you may not mention God, but I would call that moment and that recognition as holy. And I believe that holiness, first and foremost, is the depth of the human experience. Sure, we could live for a long time, but really what makes something holy is when you feel the depth of what it means to be human. When you feel like there's a meaning and a purpose to this life and there's beauty and you want to change things for the better, that's when you find holiness resonates with something deep inside your soul. And if you're willing to accept this premise that holiness is the depth of the human experience, when it comes to our sexuality, what is it that differentiates us as human beings from animals? Well, the answer is quite simply consent. Consent is the highest and also the most human sexual ethic. And a human being's ability to say no and to have that no be respected is just as sacred as a human being's ability to say yes and to have that yes be respected. So consent, in my opinion, is holy. Because consent is what it means to experience the depths of being fully human. And when we look at this story of a king who does not care for consent, who only wants Vashti to obey his every command and to do things that are egregious and lewd and horrific. When we look at this king and who he was, and Vashti knowing full well what the consequences would probably be, I have no problem, even without a mention of God, recognizing Vashti's no as completely and utterly holy. Vashti's no is a holy moment within Scripture. Vashti's no is the work of God because she is bearing the image of God when she says to him, I don't want to do that. She is saying, I recognize my own humanity. I am not your pet. I am not something less than. I am not something that will be trampled on by you. I am a child of God, and I am worthy of saying no, whether she explicitly says that or not. And this no, as simple as it is, even without any reference to God, raises questions about your life and my life and how we participate in the work of God. How is it that you participate in God? If you look at your life, what is the work of God that's in your life? How would you say that you're participating in the gospel? How would you say that you have said something or done something that has affirmed your own humanity, your own autonomy, your own worthiness, or the autonomy, the worthiness, or humanity of another? And while it's fun to look at the Bible and imagine that we are only the heroes and only identify with the heroes, equally important in this story, men, is to look at this story and also identify as the villain. Because when we look at this king and the way he treated Vashti, there's some lessons for all of us in the way that we approach things when we move forward when opportunities present itself. I am fascinated in this story how the king here had a chance to become a hero. He could have heard Vashti's no and said, I respect your choices. And imagine how progressive that book would have been, right? He had a chance to become a hero, but instead he chose to become a villain in an effort to maintain the status quo. He wanted things to stay the same, and so he refused to hear Vashti's no. And as you live your life in 2025, a good thing for you and I to all hear when we read this story is not only to recognize ourselves in Vashti's story, but also to recognize ourselves in King Ahasuerus' story and ask ourselves, when people say no to us, are we being invited into something greater? Or is this no an opportunity for something better to occur? When I think of Vashti's story and her relationship with Ahasuerus, there's a story that happened much more recently that this story reminds me of. About 2,400 years after the story of Vashti and Ahasuerus unfold, there was a woman named Alice Ball who graduated from the University of Washington's School of Pharmacy. Upon graduating, people recognized that she was gifted, and she was offered an opportunity to go to Honolulu and the University of Hawaii to study a master's degree, and she took the opportunity. She went to Honolulu, and in 1915, she graduated from the University of Hawaii. She wrote her master's thesis on 44 pages long on the kava plant and its medicinal qualities. And I can't imagine reading this, but another man, Dr. Harry Holman, came across her writing and said, this is brilliant. And Dr. Harry Holman has an interesting position at the time. He was also in Hawaii, and his title was, he was the acting assistant surgeon at Hawaii's Leprosy Investigation Station, which is a title and a half, in my opinion. And the way things used to work back in 1915 in Hawaii is very similar to how things worked for the last 2,000 years before Alice Ball, which was if somebody was recognized to have leprosy in Oahu, they would immediately diagnose it and then ship them to a nearby island of Molokai. And Molokai became a leper colony within Hawaii because they knew how fragile their whole ecosystem was on a tiny island of Oahu. So the only way they could respond to leprosy back in 1915 was to send people to Molokai, where Harry Holman helped manage lepers and give them the best quality of life possible, while also wondering if there was some way to treat this horrific disease of leprosy. So Dr. Holman read Alice Ball's master's thesis on the kava plant, and he said, hey, there's some rumors going around that some people are able to treat leprosy in East Asia. And the plant that they use is I'm going to try my best to pronounce this, the chalmurga tree. And he invited Alice Ball to study this tree and its oils to see if there was any way that this could possibly be true, that this rumor could be true, that it could treat leprosy. Now, the problem was you couldn't just eat the oil from the chalmurga tree. You actually had to find a way to inject it. And nobody had ever cracked that code at this point. So Dr. Holman said, Alice Ball, can you figure this out? And it's here that Alice Ball did a bunch of things that I barely understand, so I have to write down and just read to you what happened next. According to the New York Times article that came out just a few years ago, she first identified the tree's two main components, chalmugric acid and hynocarpic acids. These words are not in the Bible, so I know nothing about them. From each, she isolated the active constituents, several fatty acids. She chemically modified the fatty acids by converting them to ethyl esters, a form that was water-soluble and could be injected without the harm done by the raw oil. The article goes on to say, Holman tested her treatment on his patients, and he saw that the ethyl esters were capable of killing bacteria, and he acknowledged her innovation, coining the term the Ball method in his 1922 paper published in the Journal Archives of Dermatology and Physiology. Now, you'll notice the date there is 1922, and it's Dr. Holman publishing this work. It's because Alice Ball died very young in 1916, She wasn't even 30 yet, and she never got to publish her findings. But Dr. Holman wanted to make sure that her findings went noticed. And so in 1922, he published this work. And he saw, after all of this work that Alice Ball did, he was able to take the treatment to the island of Molokai and offer it to people who had been banished to a leper colony. He writes later that 84 patients who have been on the treatment for periods ranging from 4 years to 3 months have become bacteriologically negative and free from all lesions of the disease and have been discharged from segregation. And the New York Times articles concluded by saying that the Ball method wasn't a cure for leprosy, but it was as close to one that anybody got in 1922. And she is considered to be the first person who came up with a treatment for leprosy. And as you can imagine, with this being American history, upon her death, the president of the University of Hawaii, a man named Arthur Dean, understood what she was doing, and once she passed away, stole her work, published it as his own, and called it the Dean method. And he started shipping out all these different ways to inject people with this oil, all under his guise and all under his claim. He never once gave her credit, never once acknowledged her process that was in this whole process. And Dr. Holman heard all of that Arthur Dean was doing this, and while people were being treated, Dr. Holman was very upset that Alice Ball was being forgotten in this entire process. And so he published this paper in 1922 trying to correct it, and when he confronted Arthur Dean about the fact that he was stealing Alice Ball's work, Arthur Dean said, well, my water-soluble mix of the oil, it's significantly improved from what Alice Ball presented. And Dr. Holman said, after looking at it, published in his paper in 1922, he said, I cannot see that there is any improvement from the Dean method whatsoever over the original technique as worked out by Miss Ball. And while Arthur Dean was given credit for decades, eventually in the 1970s, people from the University of Hawaii started to recognize that Alice Ball was the one who came up with the first treatment for leprosy. And then in 2000, the university made it 100% official and gave her every ounce of credit for coming up with this treatment, coming up with this miraculous work. And they actually make a plaque and dedicated February 29 as Alice Ball Day in Hawaii. And there's a plaque, if you go to the University of Hawaii today, in front of the only tree that she figured out the oil from on campus. And you can go there and see it for yourself. So I point all this out because I've just used a bunch of words that aren't in the Bible, like Ethel Esther's. I had no idea what that word means still to this day. But you know what I do know? I do know what's in the Bible. And I know who Jesus Christ is. And Jesus Christ sure spent a lot of his time curing people with leprosy, right? So it's not a far jump at all to say that treating leprosy is the work of Christ, right? And when you consider that she was doing all of this in what year? 1915. The article in the New York Times says 21st century scientists marvel at Ball's ability to hunt down Chalmugra's active constituents using her era's bare bones technology. It is a remarkable feat that she came up with. Why? To help people who were suffering from leprosy, which is so on the nose for what Jesus did with his time here on earth that it raises questions in our lives. You may not be a chemist, but at the same time, you look at Alice Ball's life, and the question all of us should ask is, what is the work of Christ in your life? What are you doing to partner with the gospel in order to bring about the kingdom of God here and now? You're not solving all the world's problems, but there should be something in your life that you are saying, I am working toward the greater good this way. I am trying to work with the love of God to help bring about this reality. I want to see a better world for everyone, so I'm trying to prioritize this in my life. And when I look at Arthur Dean and his relationship with Alice Ball, the man who stole credit for her work, I look at this and I keep scratching my head and I think to myself, this guy was the president of the University of Hawaii when all this happened. He could have gotten all the credit he wanted because this happened on his campus. But instead, Arthur Dean had a chance to be the hero, and he chose to become the villain. Why? Because he wanted to be the only hero. He didn't want to share any credit. And yet he would have had plenty of credit if he just would have said, isn't it amazing one of our students did this? Isn't it great that I was the president when this happened? Like, we'll give you the credit, man. And yet he had an opportunity and he pushed back and he thought to himself, I just want the credit. I want it all. And when I look at these two stories separated by millenniums, both Alice Ball and Queen Vashti ask us to look at our own lives and ask the question, what is the work of God in my life? Or if you're a Christian, what is the work of Christ in my life? Whether it's saying no to maintain your humanity or the humanity of another, or it's working in a lab coming up with treatments for terrible diseases. What is the work of God in your life that you are prioritizing? Because these women's lives invite us to examine who we are and how we live. And particularly in today's day and age, we have this idea of what success looks like, right? And it's easy for us to point to the traditional markers of success and say, well, I did that, so I'm successful. But we all know that that isn't traditionally what's successful. There is more to life than money and power. And when our society rewards those who promise more money and more power, it can be discouraging, right? It can be hard for us to hear. But we come back to church week after week after week to remind ourselves that there is more to life than money and power. That those goals aren't what true enjoyment of life means. Not only that, but there is more to life than merely surviving and self-preservation. There is a depth to life that we are all chasing after. And the reason we talk about the love of God and the generosity of God and the fact that we are loved infinitely by our Creator is because we believe it. And we trust that there's something more about living fully in that love than just living to see another day. Yes, there is risk involved down this road. Yes, we may experience rejection. Yes, someone may overrule us. Yes, someone may take the credit from us. But it is still worth going, knowing that things may not work out. Because the real life, Jesus teaches us, is not found in the money, the wealth, the power. The real life is found when we trust generous, open, and infinite love. When we are part of an inclusive church that welcomes everyone, whether they are queer, cis, het, or trans. When we are part of an organization that is doing its best to make things right, not just worried about what the bottom line is. When we live in a way that doesn't always ask, so what's in this for me, but instead, what will happen if I don't help them? This is where the life is. And the story of Vashti and Alice Ball remind us to keep chasing after those things. Yes, there is a story about how Queen Vashti says no and the king banishes her. Yes, there is a story about Alice Ball finding breakthrough medical research and the president of her own university stabs her in the back. But as we celebrate both of these remarkable women today, we should remind ourselves that no matter how bad King Ahasuerus was, he does not get to define the life of Queen Vashti. Her life is bigger than him. In the same way, as bad as Arthur Dean was to steal the credit from Alice Ball for this remarkable treatment of leprosy, as bad as he was, he does not get to define who the life of Alice Ball was. She has transcended him even after her death. And while you can hear those stories about these powerful men imposing their will on those who were less fortunate than them, it can cause one to become cynical and jaded and uncertain of the future. In fact, you wouldn't blame anyone for hearing these stories and thinking, what's the point? Somebody at some point is just going to ruin it anyways. But it's here that we remind ourselves of the story of Jesus. We remind ourselves that Jesus' story is a resurrection story, and that even after death, life can be found in abundant quantities. My friends, I hope that if you have been beaten down by someone or something, that you are not giving up. My hope is that you hear stories like Queen Vashti and Alice Ball, and you think to yourself, if they can do it, so can I. My hope is that you will continue to celebrate the life of Queen Vashti and the life of Alice Ball and repeat their stories when you are feeling discouraged. And I hope that you may remember all of these things as you face obstacles and uncertainties, because this book, Esther, is about us rising to the occasion, meeting it, and doing whatever we can to triumph over these odds. My friends, when you look at these stories, I have two wishes for you. May you continue to stand up for the work of God or Christ in your own life, and may you, no matter what obstacles you encounter, may you never, ever give up on love. Amen.